So, and just to finish off with the findings, I mean, the ones who were admitted, basically, you went back and looked at their performance when you started including them in the sample, and you found out that they were doing quite better in social science and humanities subjects, right? I mean, that was the main finding, wasn't it?
That's right. Well, I mean, our initial analysis was based on their grade point average. So we took an average of their grades in all subjects. And the results of that showed that people who were 2 standard deviations above the mean for the country, so these are people in the top kind of 2 or 3% of the population in terms of their grade point average. So they really are an extremely high functioning group. They're not just kind of B grade students, these are A grade students with a string of A grades. That's students that we're talking about. And those people were about 4 times more likely to develop bipolar disorder in the subsequent years that we followed them up than the people with average grades. So when we found that, we then, as a secondary analysis, wanted to look at whether there was any difference between the school subjects in terms of which doing well at which school subjects actually predicted your risk of bipolar disorder. And when we did that, we actually found, I think it's fair to say that the most striking finding was that actually it was across the board. So it was for all academic subjects had an effect where getting an A grade increased your risk of bipolar disorder. So it was all in the same direction. About half of the school subjects that was statistically significant. The other half, it was in the right direction but not significant. But there weren't any subjects for which getting an A grade actually reduced your risk of bipolar disorder. And then when we looked at the subjects which had the strongest associations, we noticed that they tended to be some of the more creative subjects. So, for example, Swedish, which includes a lot of creative writing in the Swedish curriculum, that was one of the most strongly associated, and so was music. Writing and music are both things which, in the sort of anecdotal literature, seem to have been associated with risk for bipolar disorder. One thing we didn't that didn't sort of quite support that was that when we looked at art, that had an association in the expected direction, but it wasn't quite as strong as some of the other subjects. So it's not a very clear picture when we looked at the separate subjects, but overall it tended to be more kind of arts-based subjects that tended to have the strongest effect.
I see. And just a silly question too. I mean, if we are to advise people to do less well at school, are they less likely to develop bipolar disorder?
I'm sure that's the question that a lot of teenagers are asking at the moment. Does this mean I don't have to work for my exams? I can just coast, you know?
Exactly, because okay, we know it's quite a severe illness, isn't it? I mean, it's not a good thing in many ways to have this illness.
That's right.
Many people suffer from it.
Yeah, I think there are 2 points I would make there. One is that the overall risk to people, even people in this very highly functioning group, of getting bipolar disorder is still very low. So the lifetime risk of bipolar disorder is probably less than 1%. So even if it's 4 times that risk, it's still only 1 or 2%. It's still very low in absolute terms. So it means that you shouldn't be particularly worried if your child is doing well at school. There are many more good things about doing well in school that outweigh the very slight increased risk of bipolar disorder. But the other point I would make with regard to whether you should deliberately try to avoid getting A grades is that it's almost certainly not the A grades themselves that are actually predisposing people to bipolar disorder. It's more that they have a predisposition that makes them do well and also makes them more likely to have bipolar disorder. So if you have that predisposition, you can't probably influence your risk of bipolar disorder by deliberately doing badly at school.
So it's more like a marker, and you're talking about association. It doesn't mean that it's actually causing the development of the illness, doing well at school, isn't it? And
that's right. I mean, I find it difficult to conceive of a way whereby there would be a direct causal link between school grades and risk for bipolar disorder, particularly when it's good school grades. It's difficult to see that there could be a direct link that actually having higher school grades increases your risk. It seems to me much more likely that there's something, and we can discuss what that might be in a bit, but something that perhaps predisposes people to do well at school and also predisposes them to get bipolar disorder.
And you also had just to finish off with your findings, you had the bipolar finding there as well, in terms of people who are doing really, really, really bad, also having twice as much the risk of developing bipolar disorder. Is that correct, or my understanding?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, that wasn't as strong an effect as the effect for high school grades. So those who had the higher school grades had a fourfold increased risk of bipolar disorder, but also those who did very poorly. And that was by the same criteria, so it was 2 standard deviations below the mean this time. Those people had about twice the risk of bipolar disorder. So the whole association was a kind of U-shaped association, where people at both extremes seem to be at increased risk. Okay. What that suggests to me, at any rate, it's not certain what the mechanism is.
Did these people develop a different type of bipolar disorder? I mean, were they more likely to have psychotic features during their admissions?
We weren't able to look at psychotic features in particular because of the version of ICD that was used that didn't distinguish between people with and without psychotic features. But we are looking into that at the moment. We're looking at other things that we measured, like pregnancy and birth complications and things like that, to see if there's a difference between people who scored highly in school and scored poorly. But what I think you were probably getting at there is that what this suggests to some people, and certainly to me, is that there may be at least two different routes into bipolar disorder. So 2 different mechanisms which both produce either the same disorder or perhaps produce 2 biologically distinct disorders, but which look the same to us as clinicians, and we can't distinguish them. So
you have a similar study with patients with schizophrenia, right? Where you basically found that doing really bad at school, I think, predisposed you to develop schizophrenia, or at least
with schizophrenia, the results were very strong and very consistent in one direction. That the worse you did at school, the greater your risk of schizophrenia was. And in fact, when we looked at schizophrenia, people who were in this very high scoring category, the very people that had a fourfold increased risk of bipolar disorder, there were actually no cases of schizophrenia at all in that group. So basically, the better you did at school seemed to be protecting you. Doing well at school seemed to be almost protective against schizophrenia, and yet it was increasing your risk of bipolar disorder. So there was very sharp contrast between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Without causing again, so we're always talking about associations, just to have a clear